How do you get from orchid flower to seed pod? Well, today we're going to find out. If you're trying to grow orchids from seed, one of the main components that you will need is a seed pod in which to get seed. So how do you go from an orchid flower to a seed pod? The process is fairly straightforward. First of all, you want to look at the orchid flower, and in the center is the column. The tip of the column has an anther cap, and inside the cap have the pollen grains, or Plenia. What you want to do is you take those pollen grains and you put it in the stigmatic cavity, which is a sticky area on the underside of the column. So that's what you want to put in to make sure that the plant gets pollinated. And you can tell when the plant is pollinated because the ovary on the backside of the flower will start to swell. When you do this process, the flowers that you use will fade prematurely. So if you know that's what you're going to do, you're going to have to sacrifice the flower to get some seed pods. If the anther cap is removed, the flowers will fade prematurely. And if you want to develop a seed pod, the flower will have one of two situations. It may either turn green or it will fade prematurely and the ovary will continue to swell. So the ovary is going to be the seed pod. Once it swells, it's going to be full of seed, and as it matures, it will start to change color. It will turn yellow and then brown and split, and then it'll release all the seeds. That's what tends to happen in the wild, and if you're trying to do this in your own process to flask, then you can take it one of two ways. You can grow the pod and keep it green, so once it hits a certain amount of maturity, then you remove the seed pod and keep it intact. Or you can wait until it's fully mature, it splits open, have a bag to carry all the seeds and collect all the seeds, and then from there you can discard the seed pod once all the seed has been removed. Those are the two main processes for dealing with orchid seeds. But there are a couple of tips to keep in mind during this pollination process, and I'm going to share those with you. So first, the Plenia. Now, in most orchid flowers, I think there's about 2 Plenia per flower. So there'll be 2 kind of sacs of pollen that you will find in the anther cap. Now, some Cattleyas, Lalias, and Cymbidiums can have 4 Plenia or up to 8 Plenia per anther cap, which means there's more for you to work with. Sometimes you can have just one plant and you're able to make lots of crosses because it has lots of Plenia for you to use. You can actually store the Plenia as well if you don't have a flower that's ready to receive the pollen. So sometimes the Plenia have an area that's sticky, and you can use that to stick to the side of a card, index card, or a small piece of paper, and just label it and put it in either a small paper envelope or something of that sort, and then you can just store it in a cool, dry place. Another option is if you have kind of these empty capsules, you can also put the Plenia straight into those capsules and then mark it and put it into a clean, dry place. Make sure you label everything so you don't get them confused because all pollen kind of look the same. So it's best to kind of put it in its own small envelope or small container so that you don't have to worry about it. If you want to do some long-term storage of the pollen, some people like to put it in the fridge, and some actually can go in the freezer and they'll be fine. Also, you can use some kind of desiccant packets as well so that it doesn't get too much moisture and mold. Another thing to note is trying to understand a little bit of genetics behind the crosses that you're trying to use. So if you have one plant and you're just practicing, you can take the pollen from that plant and put it onto the stigmatic surface of the same flower, and basically you did a selfing, which means it's crossed with itself. Now, this is not necessarily recommended because of the genetic diversity of the plant has been reduced when you do that, but it's totally okay if you're just practicing and this is the only plant that you have, or if you know that this is a high value plant and you're not going to really come across another one anytime soon. So if you still want to reproduce these plants, selfings are definitely one avenue that you can take. So the next is kind of a sibling cross, which is you basically want the same plant, but it comes from 2 different parents. So you have basically 2 plants and you kind of mix them together, but you know that the outcome is still going to be the exact same flower. That way it promotes some genetic diversity, and then you'll have the plant that you still want and desire, but the characteristics may be slightly different. And the third kind of cross is when you cross plants from different genus. So it could be like a Vanda crossed with a Phalaenopsis. In that case, there are a couple of considerations to keep in mind. One is to know how many chromosomes that these plants have, because sometimes if the chromosomal count is not the same, then you won't be able to have any viable seed pods. Sometimes this is trial and error, and sometimes you could really dive into and count chromosomes or look it up and stuff like that, but it requires a little bit more work on your part. Another thing to note is that if you're mixing two plants of different sizes, then it's best to use the pollen from the smaller plant as the donor into the larger plant. Then it's a lot easier to make these kinds of crosses. Also, you can look online. There is a website where you can type in what you want to cross and see if a cross has been made before, if it hasn't been made before. And that way you can kind of dictate which avenue or line you like to take. The more you get into this, the more you dive into it, it can become more nuanced and complicated and more advanced. But so far at the surface level, it's just kind of fun to make crosses, to just try something new, and then kind of expect that kind of surprise mystery at the end of what it's going to look like. Another thing with creating seed pods, it's best to use the flower closest to the bottom of the flower spike, because that way the seed pod doesn't have so much hanging material. Basically, you want to shorten the length the seed pod has to hold, because as it matures, it gets heavier, and if it gets too heavy and you don't stake it or put it in a safer location, then it can get knocked about, it can break, and it's sad when you're waiting for a seed pod and then it breaks or gets knocked over and broken. Like, that's not necessarily what you want to do. Another thing is that it's also best to use flowers that are fresher, because the stigmatid cavity has sticky sap of some kind on it, and over time it tends to dry out. So if you use it when it's nice and fresh, then it can also enhance the viability of that seed pod. And of course, the most important part is the waiting part. The biggest question I think most people get after they've pollinated the plant is, how long do they have to wait before they can harvest these seed capsules? That really depends on the plants that you're using, the crosses, and a host of other factors. There is a general chart on the AOS website that gives you green pod maturity dates. So basically that means this is the minimum maturity date for these types of plants. So if you want to harvest it early as a green pod when it's still completely intact, there are some timelines for you to use. Otherwise, if you harvest too early, the seeds won't be mature and they won't be viable. If you don't care about using green pod and you're totally fine waiting until the plant will split, then you can wait until the pod turns from green to either a slight yellow or brown, and then it will split at the seams and release all the mature seeds. If a plant is going to split, it can take anywhere from 6 months all the way up to a year for most common hybrids that you see. If you have plants that are a little bit more unusual, then the maturity of the seed pod will range quite a bit. Orchids are very varied, so some can be grown and matured in a couple of weeks, and some can take a year or more. Time you'll understand these plants better, and if you have a specific genus that you're working with, then you'll really get to understand them a lot better because you'll see them more often. So that is a quick recap of orchid pollination and some tips on how to do this process if you're looking to create orchids from seed and grow them yourself. So obviously getting seed pods can be tricky sometimes if you don't know people who are growing orchids. And it's also really hard to get seed online because most of the ones that you buy online, like, little packs of 100 orchid seeds, those tend to be scams. Really, the best way to get seed pods is in your own collection or in someone else's collection, or if you just know people that are working in groups and forums that specialize in trading orchid seeds and seed pods, that's more trustworthy. But I think sometimes it's just more fun to have your own plants to work with and create something really cool and unique. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and make sure you check out my playlist on growing orchids from seed to learn more about this process. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye!